Lyra's gaze flicked across the human technician's clumsy attempt to align the scanner. James grunted in frustration as the panel's status lights flickered from red to amber and back to red again. "Do you want me to do it for you?" Lyra drawled. Her upper arms crossed in a universal gesture of disdain. The bluish light of the observation station highlighted the faint scales on her skin, a feature of her kind that radiated an almost opalescent sheen. Her tone carried the weight of someone who had seen 1,000 petty struggles before and found them all equally pathetic. James ignored her, biting his lower lip as he nudged the scanner into place. "No thanks, I've got it. Besides, you'd probably just lecture me about how primitive our technology is." Lyra let out a low hum, one that was not quite a laugh but more a vibration of amusement. "Your species still measures time in planetary rotations. I doubt you'd appreciate my lectures on anything." "Well, you're stuck with us for this project," James replied, "unless you can get your kind to send a replacement." Lyra sighed, a sound that reverberated lightly in the enclosed lab. It was a poor match, him, an Earth-born maintenance worker with grease-stained hands, and her, a scientist from a race that considered logic and precision the cornerstones of existence. But the station was isolated, and their respective superiors had assigned them to collaborate, regardless of personal preference. The scanner finally blinked green. "There!" James exclaimed, stepping back. "See? Not so hopeless." Lyra leaned forward and peered at the readout. "The calibration is acceptable," she conceded. "But you took longer than necessary." "Maybe I'm just thorough," James said, smirking. "What's the next step, Dr. Lyra?" She tapped a slender finger on the workstation screen, pulling up a schematic. "We'll need to run a conductivity test on the external power couplings. The lab won't maintain full functionality without stable input. Do you know how to handle that? Or should I explain it to you as if you were a child?" "You could try explaining it in a way that isn't condescending," James shot back. "Just tell me which tools to grab, and we'll do it together." Lyra rolled her eyes but relented. "Fine. Fetch the spectrometer and the alignment rod from storage unit B12. I'll check the primary voltage array while you prepare the external connectors." James nodded and left the lab. The silence that followed was almost comforting to Lyra. She moved to the voltage array, her long fingers deftly entering commands into the console. Yet, her mind kept drifting to the human's stubborn persistence. He was neither the most efficient nor the most skilled assistant she had worked with, but there was something oddly distracting about his attitude. His ability to counter her sarcasm with his own witticisms was not entirely unwelcome, though she would never admit it aloud. A minute later, James returned with the tools. He handed them over and grinned. "You'll be amazed at how quickly I learn." "We'll see about that," Lyra replied, taking the equipment. "Follow my lead, and try not to trip over anything." James chuckled. "I'll do my best, but no promises." They worked side by side, their initial barbs giving way to a more cooperative rhythm. Lyra explained the steps in precise detail, and James carried them out without protest. When he occasionally made a mistake, she corrected him, but her tone softened ever so slightly. The task took longer than it would have if she'd done it alone, but by the time the power couplings were stabilized, she found herself almost impressed. "Almost. There. The readings are stable," Lyra announced, gesturing to the data screen. "Nice," James said, brushing his hands off on his work pants. "What's next?" "Next, we ensure the station's environmental controls are running at optimal efficiency," she replied. "But first, you might want to wash your hands. I doubt my colleagues would appreciate you smudging every surface with your earthly residue." James laughed. "Sure, as long as you don't start calling me primate number 1 again." Lyra didn't smile, but the ridges along her temples smoothed slightly. "You're not quite that intolerable yet." They made their way to the station's environmental console, and as Lyra detailed the next set of instructions, James couldn't help but feel that perhaps, just maybe, the aloof alien scientist was warming up to him. Just a little. Chapter 2. The experiment begins. The lab was quiet except for the low hum of equipment and the occasional faint tap of Lyra's long, thin fingers on her workstation. The human, James, stood a short distance away, leaning against a console as he examined the newly installed control panel. His face was a picture of careful concentration, though the occasional muttered curse under his breath suggested things weren't going quite as smoothly as he hoped. "Are you planning to glare at it until it works?" Lyra's voice broke the silence, sharp as a blade. She didn't even glance up from her screen. "Actually, I was thinking of using a hammer," James shot back, his lips curling into a half-smile. "A very human approach," she replied, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "If you smash it, I'm sure it'll behave much better." "Got a better idea?" James asked, straightening. "Of course," Lyra said, swiveling her chair around. She gestured at the screen he was fumbling with. "Run a diagnostic through the secondary interface. You're trying to force a direct response when it's likely a routing issue. The secondary interface bypasses that entirely." James nodded, moving to the console she indicated. He entered a series of commands, his brow furrowing as he followed her instructions. Lyra watched him with a detached curiosity. Humans fascinated her, well, not all humans, just James. Most members of his species would have floundered by now, giving in to frustration or despair. But James kept going, even if he grumbled about it. "Okay, it's running the diagnostic," James said after a minute. "Good," Lyra replied. She turned back to her own work, her voice shifting to a more instructive tone. "While we wait, I need you to help calibrate the sensory array. We'll be using it for the next phase of the experiment." James moved over, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, just tell me what to do." She handed him a small tool that resembled a screwdriver but emitted a faint bluish light at the tip. "Insert this into the panel's lower access port. Then adjust the frequency by turning it clockwise until the display shows exactly 7.3. James crouched down, muttering something inaudible as he found the access port. He worked carefully, his hands steady despite his earlier annoyance. Lyra watched him without comment, noting his focus and the way he seemed to measure each movement. He wasn't just fumbling his way through, he was learning. 7.3, James said, standing up. "Good," Lyra said. "Now, activate the array's main power sequence. I'll monitor the readings." James moved to the main console, his fingers dancing over the keys. Lyra watched the data stream across her screen, a small smile tugging at her lips. The readings were stable, better than she'd expected. "Not bad," she admitted. "Is that a compliment?" James asked, raising an eyebrow. "An observation," she replied, though there was a hint of warmth in her voice. They worked together in relative silence for the next hour, fine-tuning the equipment and preparing for the first real test. James asked questions here and there, and Lyra answered them patiently, surprised by how easily they fell into a rhythm. When they hit a snag, James would offer a suggestion, and Lyra would either refine it or dismiss it. But each time, she found herself appreciating his willingness to think through the problem. As the experiment neared its first trial run, James glanced over at Lyra. "So, what exactly is this phase supposed to tell us?" Lyra hesitated, then explained, "The sensory array will measure how humans react to certain stimuli, how you process information, how quickly you adapt to changes in the environment. It's a way of understanding your species on a deeper level." James frowned. "Sounds a little invasive." Lyra tilted her head. "Perhaps, but it's necessary. Your species is a puzzle, one that might be worth solving." James met her gaze, something unreadable in his expression. "Well, as long as you don't start poking needles into me, I guess I'll play along." "No needles," Lyra said, a faint smirk crossing her face. "For now." James laughed, and Lyra found herself startled by the sound. It was genuine, unrestrained, and it caught her off guard. She quickly turned back to her screen, but the sound stayed with her, a strange echo in her mind. When they finally initiated the experiment, everything worked smoothly. The readings came through clearly, the array functioned as intended, and James, despite his initial skepticism, handled his role with surprising competence. As they finished, Lyra leaned back in her chair, looking at James. "You did well," she said simply. "Thanks," James replied. "I'll take what I can get." He left to clean up the workspace, and Lyra turned her attention back to her data. But for the first time, her thoughts lingered on the human who had just walked out the door. Chapter 3. Shared Perspectives. "You're telling me your people never sing?" James asked, leaning against the edge of the console. Lyra arched a brow ridge, the soft lighting of the observation deck catching the faint iridescence of her skin. "Singing is unnecessary. It serves no practical purpose." "It's not about practical purpose," James said. He swiveled in his chair to face her fully. "It's about expression, a way to connect, to share feelings. Joy, sorrow, anger, love. Humans have been singing since we had voices." Lyra tilted her head, her yellow eyes narrowing slightly. "Feelings," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "I have seen how emotions drive your species. They're chaotic, irrational. And yet you claim they're valuable." James chuckled. "Valuable doesn't even cover it. Without them, what's the point? All the technology, all the progress. It's meaningless without something to feel, something to care about." She tapped a finger against her chin, her gaze drifting to the view beyond the observation window. Earth loomed large, its blue and green surface speckled with white clouds. The sight was almost too vivid, almost too beautiful for her to comprehend. Her kind had long considered their emotions to be distractions, weaknesses. But the more time she spent around James, the more she wondered if perhaps they had missed something important. "What would you sing about?" she asked suddenly, her tone more curious than mocking. "Right now." James smiled, thinking for a moment. "Maybe about this station. About being out here in the middle of nowhere, with just you and me, trying to figure out how the universe works." "You would sing about me?" Lyra asked, her voice laced with both surprise and skepticism. "Sure," James said with a shrug. "Why not? That's the thing about music. It can be about anything. Even an alien scientist who thinks emotions are a waste of time." Lyra couldn't help but smirk. "You're more unusual than I initially thought, James." "I'll take that as a compliment." They fell into a comfortable silence for a moment, the hum of the station's systems filling the air. Then James leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms behind his head. "All right, your turn. Tell me about something your people do that humans wouldn't understand." Lyra hesitated, her fingers brushing the surface of the console. "We have a ritual," she began slowly, choosing her words carefully. "It's a kind of mental exercise. We link our minds in a shared neural network and examine complex problems together. It allows us to see solutions from multiple angles, all at once." "Like a brainstorming session?" James asked. "More than that," she said. "When the link is active, there is no individuality, no single thought. We become one mind, one purpose." James whistled softly. "That's intense. Doesn't it feel weird, losing yourself like that?" "It is not about loss," Lyra replied. "It is about clarity, efficiency. Our decisions are made collectively, free from personal bias." "Personal bias isn't always a bad thing," James said, leaning forward. "Sometimes individuality helps you see a problem in a way no one else would. It sparks creativity, innovation." "Creativity?" Lyra repeated, as if the word were a puzzle. "Your people value this quality highly." "We do," James said. "It's how we've survived, coming up with new ideas, new ways to solve problems. And yeah, sometimes that means emotions get in the way. But sometimes they lead to breakthroughs no one saw coming." Lyra regarded him thoughtfully. "You believe your chaos has value." "I know it does," James said with a small grin. "And I think if you tried singing, you might feel that too, even if it's just once." "I will consider it," Lyra said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. James chuckled. "That's all I ask. Just consider it." As they returned to their respective tasks, Lyra couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over her. James's perspective was so different, so foreign, yet it lingered in her mind. For the first time, She found herself questioning the rigid structures she had always known. Perhaps there was more to the universe than logic and precision. Perhaps there was something to be learned from the chaos of humanity. Chapter 4, Breaking Boundaries. I still don't get why you don't use something simpler, James said, crouched next to a set of exposed power relays. His sleeves were rolled up, and his hands moved carefully, undoing a series of tangled wiring. Lyra stood over him, her arms folded. Simpler doesn't mean better. Your approach would leave the relay susceptible to overload. Maybe, James said, his tone light, but we'd have it up and running a lot faster, and then we'd spend twice as long fixing it, Lyra countered. Touché, James replied, not looking up from his work. Still, there's something to be said for efficiency. Efficiency, Lyra repeated, tilting her head. You and I seem to have different definitions of the word. James laughed softly. That's because I'm not trying to impress a council of alien geniuses. I just want this thing to work without sparking every time we flip the switch. She let out a small sigh, though the corner of her mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. If you keep the pressure steady on that coupling, I'll adjust the main array. Deal, James said. But don't forget to walk me through what you're doing. I like knowing what's going on. Lyra stepped around the console, her hands moving with practiced precision. This component here regulates the output flow. If it's not calibrated perfectly, the entire relay will destabilize. Got it, James said, nodding as he worked. And what happens if the flow regulation is too low? Then the system underperforms, leading to reduced efficiency. Reduced efficiency, James interrupted with a grin. Right, because that's the worst thing in the galaxy. Lyra shot him a sharp glance, but there was no malice behind it. Perhaps not the worst, but far from acceptable. Relax, I'm kidding, James said. You know, it's actually kind of interesting working with you. You've got this whole no-nonsense approach, but underneath it, I think you're actually enjoying yourself. Lyra paused for a fraction of a second, her hands stilling over the console. Enjoying myself? Hardly. I take my work seriously. Sure you do, James said, his smile widening. But every now and then, you get that little look. Like you're not just solving a problem, you're, exploring something new. It's nice to see. Lyra's brow furrowed. I'm not sure what you mean. It's like, James stopped thinking. It's like when a human kid sees something for the first time. That spark of curiosity, that moment where they're just wowed. I see that on your face sometimes. I do not wow, Lyra said, her voice flat. No? Well, you might not call it that, but it's there, James said. And I think that's a good thing. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the station's systems. Lyra returned to her adjustments, but she didn't say anything more. Finally, James spoke again. So, what's next on the checklist? Lyra glanced at her monitor. We need to test the relay under full load conditions. If it passes, we can move on to the environmental controls. All right, let's do it, James said. He stepped back, brushing his hands off on his pants. Ready when you are. Lyra nodded, her focus returning to the task at hand. She keyed in the final commands, and the relay system powered up. As the readings stabilized, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Looks good, James said. Guess your not-so-simple method worked after all. It always does, Lyra said, her tone firm, though there was a faint trace of amusement in her voice. As they moved to the environmental control module, their rhythm remained steady. Lyra gave instructions, and James followed them without complaint. Occasionally, he would offer a suggestion, and while she didn't always agree, she found herself considering his input more often than not. You know, James said as they finished their final adjustments, we actually make a pretty good team. I'm not sure what you mean, Lyra replied, though her tone was less defensive than before. I mean, we're different, but sometimes that works in our favor, James said. You bring all the high-level technical know-how, and I keep us grounded. Grounded, Lyra repeated, considering the word. I suppose that's one way to describe it. See? You're even agreeing with me now, James said with a grin. Don't get used to it, Lyra said. though the faint glimmer in her eyes suggested she didn't entirely mean it. Chapter 5, The Touch of Trust. All right, let me get this straight, James said, leaning over the control panel as his fingers moved swiftly across the screen. You want me to reconfigure the array, while it's still running, to recalibrate the station's oxygen levels? Lyra stood beside him, arms crossed. That's correct. The system can handle it as long as you follow the steps I outlined. You say that like it's no big deal, James muttered. Meanwhile, I'm over here one wrong move away from turning this place into a vacuum. You underestimate yourself, Lyra said coolly, though she leaned in slightly. Besides, I'll be monitoring the process. If you make an error, I'll correct it. James glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. No pressure, huh? You should be used to it by now, she replied, the faintest hint of amusement creeping into her voice. He gave a half-smile. Fair enough. As he worked, the console emitted a low, steady beep, indicating each successful input. Lyra watched closely, her gaze sharp but no longer cold. Over the past weeks, her view of James had shifted in subtle ways. His methods were often messy and his approach unsophisticated, but he was resourceful. More than that, he was unrelentingly steady. James let out a low whistle. Okay, readings look stable. What's next? Lyra tilted her head, her scaled fingers brushing the edge of the console. Adjust the CO2 scrubbing filters by 0.3%. That should bring the oxygen levels into the optimal range. James. NG her a grin. I wouldn't go that far, she replied, though her lips twitched as if suppressing a smile. They moved to the next module, a smaller station tucked into the corner of the lab. James crouched down, opening a maintenance hatch. All right, what's this one for again? This is the atmospheric stability monitor, Lyra explained. It measures changes in pressure and ensures that environmental shifts remain within safe parameters. James nodded. Got it. What do you need me to do? Remove the old sensor and replace it with the updated one, she said. It's a simple process. Just make sure the connector is aligned properly before you seal it. Simple, huh? James muttered. We'll see about that. As he worked, Lyra stepped back, watching him carefully. His movements were deliberate and confident, and for the first time, she found herself at ease with the idea of letting him handle it on his own. After a few minutes, James leaned back and let out a satisfied breath. All right, it's in. How does it look on your end? Lyra glanced at her screen, scanning the new data. Acceptable, she said, her voice softer than usual. James stood, brushing off his hands. Glad to hear it. They stood there for a moment, the lab filled with the quiet hum of the station's systems. Lyra glanced at James, noticing the way his expression had softened. His usual grin was replaced with a more thoughtful look, as if he were considering something carefully. What is it? She asked, breaking the silence. Nothing, James said at first, then hesitated. Actually, it's just, you're different than I expected. Different? Lyra echoed, her voice laced with curiosity. Yeah, James said. When we first started working together, I thought you were just another cold, distant scientist. But you're not. You care about what you're doing. And I think... He stopped, shaking his head slightly. Never mind. Go on, Lyra said, her tone softer than usual. I think you care about more than just the work, James said. You just don't show it the way humans do. Lyra didn't reply immediately. Instead, she looked at him, her yellow eyes searching his face. Your perceptions are intriguing, she said at last. But I have no reason to deny them. James chuckled. I'll take that as agreement. Lyra stepped closer, surprising herself. Perhaps you should. The lab's lights flickered for a brief moment, and James reached out instinctively, placing a hand on her arm. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a ripple of something unfamiliar through her. She looked down at his hand, then back up at him. Sorry, he said, withdrawing his hand quickly. The lights. It's fine, she interrupted, her voice steady. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lyra turned back to the console. Let's finish the diagnostics, she said, her tone returning to its usual calm. James nodded, though a small, thoughtful smile lingered on his face as they got back to work. Chapter 6. A Lesson in Fear. Lyra paced the lab, the tips of her fingers trailing along the edge of the central console. The readings still aren't stable, she said, her voice clipped. James was lying on his back beneath a mass of tangled conduits, grumbling as he worked. I'm telling you, it's not the power regulator. The issue's upstream. Upstream. Lyra stopped and crossed her arms. What does that even mean? The flow rates are consistent. It's the regulator that's failing to maintain the required thresholds. James shoved himself out from under the console and sat up, grease smudging his face. I mean the data feed from the main array. It's spiking at irregular intervals. We fixed that, we fixed the regulator. You have no proof of that, Lyra countered. I've been watching it for hours. Trust me, James said, getting to his feet. Lyra narrowed her eyes. Trust. A human word that often precedes ill-advised action. He rolled his eyes, grabbing a nearby datapad. You know, you could try listening to me once in a while. I've been doing this kind of work since before you decided humans were worth studying. Lyra's brow ridge twitched, and she let out a sharp breath. Fine. Let's follow your theory and see if it holds up. But if it fails, I'm holding you accountable. Sure, James said, flashing a quick smile. If I'm wrong, you can say, I told you so, as much as you want. Lyra allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smirk. I'll hold you to that. They worked side by side, James pulling up system logs and tracing the fluctuations he'd noticed. Lyra monitored the diagnostics, her gaze darting between the displays. Their usual banter gave way to a focused silence, the kind that only came when both of them were deeply immersed in solving a puzzle. There, James said suddenly, pointing at the screen. Look at that spike. It's the input from the primary array. That's what's throwing off the regulator. Lyra leaned in, her eyes narrowing. Interesting. If we adjust the array's input frequency, yes, that might stabilize the flow. Told you, James said, though there was no smugness in his tone this time. He was already grabbing the tools they'd need. Lyra shot him a glance, one that carried a hint of respect. You may have been correct, but we're not finished yet. Let's see if your fix actually works. James chuckled. Fair enough. Let's get to it. They set to work, James handling the physical adjustments while Lyra recalibrated the system's settings. The air in the lab felt charged, not just from the equipment but from the silent understanding that had formed between them. As they finished, the display readings slowly leveled out, the erratic spikes smoothing into a steady pattern. Lyra nodded, her expression calm but satisfied. It's holding. Well done. James leaned back against the console, wiping sweat from his forehead. Team effort, right? Perhaps, Lyra said. She looked at him for a moment, then added, You were right to suggest that approach. I'll admit it. He raised an eyebrow. Wow, an admission from you. Should I record this moment for posterity? Don't push it, Lyra said. But there was a faint warmth in her voice. They shared a quiet laugh before turning back to their respective tasks. Though the work was done for now, something had shifted between them. A mutual recognition of each other's abilities and a growing sense of trust that neither of them had expected. Chapter 7. First Kiss. The quiet hum of the observation station systems provided a gentle backdrop as James set down a piece of equipment on the workbench. He wiped his hands on a rag and glanced over at Lyra, who was seated at the console. She appeared lost in thought, her yellow eyes fixed on a set of readings. What's on your mind? James asked, walking over to her. Lyra looked up, startled. Nothing of significance, she replied curtly, though her expression softened slightly. James leaned against the edge of the console, crossing his arms. Come on, you've been staring at that screen for the past 20 minutes. You're not even typing. Lyra hesitated, then sighed. I was reflecting on recent events. Sounds serious, James said lightly. Anything you want to share? Her eyes narrowed, but not in anger, more in consideration. It's about trust, she admitted after a moment. You've mentioned it before. I thought I understood the concept, but now I'm not so certain. James tilted his head. What's got you doubting it? The recent equipment adjustments, she said. When I followed your suggestion, I trusted your judgment, even though it contradicted my initial assessment. That trust was rewarded, but it still feels foreign. Because you're not used to relying on someone else? James asked. Precisely, Lyra said. Among my kind, decisions are made collectively, through careful analysis. But here it was just you and me. I had to take your word, and that is not something I'm accustomed to. James smiled. Well, you did it and it worked out. That's what trust is. It's not always logical or calculated. Sometimes it's just a feeling that the other person's got your back. Lyra stared at him for a long moment. You speak as though this is a natural state for humans, trusting one another so readily. Not always, James said, his voice quieter now. It takes time, but when it's there, it makes a difference. She nodded slowly, her gaze flickering to the display again. It's a concept I will need to consider further. Take your time, James said. No rush. They worked quietly for a while, finishing up the last of their tasks for the day. The lab's lights dimmed slightly as the station shifted into its evening cycle. James stretched his arms and let out a small sigh. I think that's enough for one day, he said. What do you think? Lyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Agreed. Perhaps some rest is in order. James hesitated, then added, or we could just sit here for a while. Talk about something other than work. Talk about what? Lyra asked, her tone cautious. Anything, James said with a shrug. Earth, your homeworld. Even that weird beverage you made me try last week. What do you call it? Kellerin? Lyra's lips twitched. Kellerin is not weird. It is a perfectly balanced nutritional supplement. I think the word you're looking for is bland, James said with a grin. You have no taste, Lyra replied, though her tone was lighter than before. They sat across from each other, the console between them. The conversation meandered about James's favorite places back on Earth, about the way Lyra's people navigated through interstellar space, and even about the time James accidentally reversed the gravity settings in one of the station's storage rooms. Lyra let out a soft, brief laugh at that story, and James stared at her for a moment, caught off guard. You know, he said, I don't think I've ever heard you laugh before. She looked at him, her expression guarded. I rarely find amusement in human behavior. Sure, James said, leaning forward slightly, but you just laughed at something I did. I suppose I did, Lyra admitted. James smiled. Well, I'm calling that progress. They fell silent again, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. The faint hum of the station filled the space between them. After a while, Lyra spoke again. James, why do you do it? Do what? He asked, tilting his head. Keep trying to connect with me, she said, her voice quieter than before. He paused, considering her question. Because you're worth connecting with, he said simply. You're not just some cold, calculating scientist. You're curious. You care about the work, about the people you help, even if you don't always show it. I see that in you. Lyra's gaze dropped, her hands resting on the console. She said nothing at first, then finally met his eyes. I am not sure what to say. You don't have to say anything, James said. They sat there, the station's lights dimmed, and the conversation slowed. Eventually, James stood up, stretching. I guess we should call it a night. Lyra nodded, standing as well. As she moved past him toward the exit, James caught her arm gently. She stopped, looking at him. Hey, he said softly. You're doing fine. Lyra hesitated, then inclined her head. Thank you, James. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them moved. James smiled, then let go. Good night, Lyra. Good night, James, she replied, turning away. Chapter 8. Understanding the Meaning of Fear. Lyra leaned against the console, staring at the complex array of data streams projected onto the screen. The soft blue glow from the holographic display reflected in her eyes, as she reviewed the final results of the long-running experiment. "Looks like it worked," James said from behind her. His voice was calm, but there was a trace of weariness. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, tools scattered around him as he finished sealing the last panel. "Your equations, my hands. Not a bad combo." Lyra glanced over her shoulder. "I must admit, the outcome is satisfactory." "Satisfactory?" James repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I think you mean impressive. It's all right, you can say it." Lyra returned her gaze to the display. "Let's not get carried away." James stood and walked over, wiping his hands on his pants. "Sure, satisfactory it is." He leaned against the console next to her. "So what now? We submit the results to your people, call it a day, and I go back to fixing air filters while you move on to some other mysterious project." "That is the logical course of action," Lyra replied, but her voice lacked the usual sharp edge. James picked up on it. "That doesn't sound like you're ready to leave it all behind." She hesitated, her fingers resting on the console's edge. "The data we've gathered here is significant. It will help my people understand your species in ways they never have before." But what?" Lyra turned to face him fully. "I find myself considering things I never did before. Emotions, trust, fear." James frowned. "Fear?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "In our earlier work, when the relay system malfunctioned, I felt fear. Not for myself, but for you." He blinked, caught off guard. "Me? I did not understand it at the time," she continued. "But now, after everything we've done together, I believe I do. Fear is not merely a survival mechanism. It is a signal. It shows you what matters." James looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess it does." Lyra stepped closer, her movements uncharacteristically hesitant. "Your species, you find strength in these feelings. You allow them to guide you, even when they defy logic." "Sometimes, yeah," James said, "but not all the time. It's about balance. We feel things, sure, but we try to keep our heads clear too. At least the good ones do." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "That balance is what I admire. It is something I must learn." "Hey, you've come a long way already," James said, his voice warm. "You've started to trust. You've laughed at my dumb jokes." "I did not laugh," Lyra interrupted, though her tone was lighter than usual. "You definitely laughed," James said, smiling. "And now you're talking about fear like it's not just some abstract concept. That's progress." She met his gaze, her expression softening. "Perhaps you're right." James chuckled. "That's another thing I never thought I'd hear you say." Lyra stepped back, looking out the observation window at the distant stars. "Your kind is more complex than I imagined. You are not merely primitives fumbling through the universe. You are adaptable. And you're not as cold and unfeeling as you let on," James said gently. "You're curious. You care. You just didn't realize it at first." Lyra looked at him again, her yellow eyes steady. "Perhaps you're correct." James shrugged. "It's been known to happen." They stood in silence for a moment, the station's hum filling the air. Then Lyra spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "What will you do once this is over?" "I don't know," James admitted. "Probably head back to Earth. Find another station to work on. Keep doing my thing." "And if you had the choice?" James considered her question carefully. "If I had the choice, I'd stay here." Lyra blinked, surprised. "Why?" "Because I'd like to see what happens next," James said simply. "There's more to learn. About you, about me, about this whole human-alien collaboration thing. I think we've only scratched the surface." Lyra studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I think I would like that as well." James smiled. "Good. Maybe we can figure it out together." "Together," Lyra said softly. They turned back to the console, side by side, ready to face whatever challenges the universe might bring, this time as partners.